Hey guys, it's your boy M.K.S here, back in another video. I know this month and the last couple of months I wanted to focus mostly on Asia and Asian empowerment and ideas to do with it. I thought that this video basically is inspired by some Facebook groups which talk about, unfortunately in Australia, there's been, or even probably Australasia, altogether, like in Australia itself, possibly in the surrounding islands like the Torres and Strait Pacific Islands, and in New Zealand, there's been like a lot of problems for Indigenous people with like deaths in custody and things like that, which I think haven't been talked about much. So I thought I'd talk about some of my ideas about how I hope to empower Indigenous people from Australasia, and how I hope that through these ideas, which I hope to discuss, such groups or communities can be empowered, which will hopefully help them to get out of trouble in the first place, and also give them more legal rights and protections. So I think it's worth discussing the idea, and I would have discussed it in a different time, like a different month, but I thought it would be quite important. It's quite an important issue, so I thought I'd cover it as soon as possible. So anyway, here are some ideas for areas which I think would help Indigenous Australasians from all over Australasia, as I say, from Australia itself and from the Torres and Strait Pacific Island, how we pronounce it, and New Zealand as well. So I hope you enjoy this video, although it's a bit of a serious and sad topic. I hope you also see that it's quite important and hopefully spread the message. So hopefully we can empower people and make a positive, which is what I generally try and do if I can. So here goes. So number one, I think it'd be great for Indigenous people from across Australasia to get empowered in STEM, so that to put pressure on the Australian, Torres and Strait Pacific Island and New Zealand governments or politicians generally to encourage them to support STEM training for Indigenous Australasians. I'll say as many Indigenous Australasians to get at least an hour's training in possibly each of those subjects, like science, tech, engineering, and maths. So for Indigenous people from Australasia to be trained for at least an hour a day in each of those subjects, so like that's 4 hours a day, possibly more. So as many hours as possible, or as much time as possible in those areas, which hopefully would help them to get more empowered jobs and more rights. I mean, these ideas I know might not necessarily make all their problems. Obviously, in fact, I'm sure they'll always have some problems, like every community will have, but hopefully it will help them to be empowered as much as possible. And I forgot to say in the intro, I'd love to hear your ideas as well about how you think Indigenous Australasians could be empowered. Secondly, I think it'd be great to see them being united as much as possible and getting as much training as possible in areas like the law, so they can get the legal rights and know what the legal rights are, and also where they work together, and also organizations like NGOs, charities, and solicitors, lawyers, legal teams, represent them as much as possible, and that sort of thing, represent them and those sorts of organizations, represent them as much as possible in the law, so that they get as many legal rights as possible generally. So if they're stopped by the police, they get legal rights. Obviously, I mean, I would always encourage them to obey the law as much as possible. So obviously, if they do break the law, just like any other group, obviously they should face the same judgment or justice as anyone else. So it should be equal justice for all. But obviously, they need the same legal rights as every other group as well, in my opinion. I hope that all makes sense. Number three, again, I'd love to see charities, NGOs, and organizations supporting them as much as possible, like I say, in STEM, in training, and also possibly teaching about law, also making sure they get legal representation generally, as much as possible, so they get human rights just the same as any other group, and maybe be encouraged to be empowered so that they stay out of trouble with the law and that sort of thing as much as possible. Number four, again, I would love to see Indigenous Australasians being trained to work within the law as solicitors, lawyers, barristers, maybe even and judges, so they can get access to equal opportunities and also work with Human Rights Commission. I know there are already some organisations doing that, so I hope to encourage that as much as possible. But maybe if more people around the world also learn about their plight, like for instance, people often talk about Black Lives Matter in America or even in the UK, but possibly don't think about that in other countries or other places such as Australia and what they're going through, and those and Australasia generally. And I think it'd be great also to see Indigenous Australasians being in the police, so that hopefully they can represent each other as well, and also hopefully more Indigenous Australasian children, especially young people like teenagers or even pre-teens, can have a better relation with the police, who go into schools and work with Indigenous Australasians, and also work with their communities as well, to discuss their rights and that sort of thing. And so hopefully if they get along with the police more, the police get on well with them more and they get on well with the police more. Maybe I'm being naive, but hopefully that would help, like I say, police going into schools and working with Indigenous Australasian children, maybe even forming a bond with them and friendship and playing sports with them and things like that. So hopefully that liaising with the police or working with the police kind of will help them. But also, maybe I'm being naive, but I think it'd be great for it's like say, instead of joining the military, Indigenous Australians who would join the military instead could perhaps join the police, and again, legal profession. I know there could be a counter argument to that, because people might say that there already are Indigenous Australians in the police, and that doesn't necessarily stop those sorts of things from happening, injustices. But I think that it's worth a try. I think all these ideas might be naive of me, but I think it's worth a try to actually try and implement these things and see if they do make change. Like, for instance, maybe 10% of the police force could be made up of Indigenous Australians, and also 10% of the legal structure itself, like 10% of solicitors or lawyers or whatever they're called in Australia, or barristers. I don't know if that's a UK term, but barristers or judges or people like that. 10% of each of those things, of those groups being Indigenous, or maybe even more, or at least 10%. It could be quotas. I'm not always a big fan of quotas, but I think it would be good to see more Indigenous Australians represent their own community and each other. And also, I think instead of joining the military, I think it'd be better to join the legal structure and the police. Number 5, again, I'd love to hear other people's views on my ideas. Hopefully they won't be too rude, but maybe they are naive. Maybe other people have better ideas or different ideas which you could share or even add to these ideas, or which ones you think are the worst or the best ideas as ever, and whether you think STEM or education in those sorts of areas, or again the law, or things like that would actually benefit Indigenous Australians or not, or whether you think I'm being naive or not, or again, whatever ideas you have. And again, maybe more human rights commissions could help them, and more, maybe even international organisations like the UN or others, hearing about the plight of Indigenous Australians and talk about how to change the negative situations that they go through. And also, I think it'd be great to hear Indigenous Australians having hearing their aspirations and dreams and ambitions, and how to help them, and learning how to help them, or discussing how to help them. And again, supporting them in areas at school where they could be encouraged. More Indigenous Australians could be encouraged to go into things like medicine or general STEM subjects again, and things like that. Number 6, I'd love to hear about Indigenous Australians getting opportunities in sport. Again, as I've often talked about before, as an Italian football fan, I'd love to see Italy having. I know Italy does have its own racism problem, but I think it would be great to see Italian football having academies in Australasia, for Indigenous Australians to get into football or soccer or whatever you want to call it, or calcio as it's called in Italy, I believe. And number 7, again, I'd love to see. On that note, I'd love to see Celtic FC having football academies for Indigenous Australians. Maybe it could be Italian teams, and Celtic could be the first to get in there, and then maybe in the future there could be some great Indigenous Australians football or soccer players again, and Italian football and Celtic will hopefully benefit as well. So hopefully it'll be a mutual benefit. Number 8, again, I'd love to hear from different groups who want to support Indigenous Australians, like NGOs, putting pressure on politicians and governments having to talk about what sort of rights and support they would vow to give to Indigenous Australians, and hopefully obviously honour their pledges about what they're going to do for Indigenous Australasians. Number 9, I'd love to support Indigenous Australasians as writers, authors, artists, or in areas like that. And again, different areas, different fields which, like architecture or fields like that, which might benefit in the long term, like design or other areas where they could do well. And number 10, I would love to empower the Indigenous youth, as I say, and also I have a controversial idea or dream where Indigenous Australians will own at least 10% of all the property and land, which obviously as they originate from there, I think would be quite fair. I know, again, that might be a bit of a controversial or maybe even a naive idea, but I think that would be an excellent thing. So as ever, I'd love to hear what your thoughts or ideas are, and I'm out. Peace and love.